Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to the program. Now we turn our attention towards those companies on the market who are providing Muslims with a halal alternative to, a halal alternative to investment finance and savings. Sentio Capital Management was established 15 years ago to meet those needs. We welcome Director and Portfolio Manager Imtiaz Suliman. He joins me now. Assalamu alaikum Imtiaz and welcome to the program.
Salam, Lukman, Jazakallah for having me.
Jazakallah khair for your time. Imtiaz, the reason why we're speaking to you is, we want to, obviously give Muslim listeners and viewers the alternatives to, what is out there conventionally. And, we obviously are going to be speaking to you about that. So tell us about Sentio Capital Management. When did it begin? Who started the company? What was the ethos with which you started the company? And how's it been going so far? 15 years is quite a long time.
Yeah, shukr, alhamdulillah. Sentio
Mashallah.
was started in 2007
Mm-hmm.
by Mohammed Mayat and Rayan Joseph. Effectively, they came out of the big asset managers in the South African space, and they wanted to start a asset manager that brings two disciplines together. And the disciplines are one of fundamental analysis. This is whereby you go and analyze companies, build financial models, and trying to value and find a value for the company. And then you have the quantitative side, which is screening for companies that look attractive, and integrating those two disciplines together. So essentially, it was something new at that point in time. There's a lot more companies and asset managers combining fundamental analysis with quantitative techniques today. But Alhamdulillah, Sentio was one of the pioneers of bringing these two disciplines together.
Mm.
And it's all about investing and finding assets that are underpriced and buying those assets so that you can make money on behalf of the clients that trust their money with Sentio Capital.
Mhm. Now, Imtiaz, is there? My next question is with regards to attitude. Is there an appetite for this type of investment within our Muslim community, or do you find some of your clients also come from other communities who also know the value of this type of investment in terms of Sharia compliant investments?
Yeah, so if you look at it from a Sharia compliancy perspective,
Hmm.
there's Sharia compliance is effectively a subset of ESG, environmental social governance, and there's a
Right.
lot of investors who want to invest for good, and they want to make sure that their money is not being used for purposes that don't follow their beliefs. So this could be a Muslim investor or a non-Muslim investor. For example, you might have a non-Muslim investor who doesn't want to invest into companies that produce arms and weapons, for example. And
Mm.
those companies, from a Sharia perspective, are excluded. So you do have a crossover between the two disciplines of investing, but from a Sharia perspective, it follows the normal Sharia guidelines where you're not able to invest in companies that produce alcohol, uh, uh, deal in pork-related products, tobacco, financial services, where Mufti was just talking about interest and the harms of interest. So those
Hmm.
companies are excluded. And then from a screening perspective, even if you have a company that is Sharia compliant, there's certain rules that they need to adhere to for them to be Sharia compliant. For example, they might have some cash that the company keeps, but the interest that they generate from that cash mustn't be more than 5% of their total revenues. So that's
Right.
from a Sharia compliance perspective. And as I mentioned, it appeals to everyone. Anyone can invest. It's not limited to just a Muslim investor. The funds, effectively, what we're trying to do at Sentio Capital is to give an investor, a Sharia investor, a return that is compatible to any other fund that's out there, whether it's on the
Fantastic.
non-Sharia side and the Sharia side. And that's what we're trying to do. We don't want
Mm.
a Sharia investor to be inferior to
Right.
what's available in the market. They need to generate
Hmm.
good returns. They need to make sure that their savings are growing at a rate that will meet their financial needs. And they also need to save for certain financial goals that they might have. And we want to
Okay.
generate those returns that are compatible to any fund out there. So when you look at our fund, our benchmark is not the Sharia index, for example. It's
Okay.
a normal average of the total fund universe that's out there. And that's what we benchmark ourselves against.
Okay. No, fantastic, Imtiaz. Before we get to the actual type of investment products you have, I think a comment that I would have to your last answer is that it does not necessarily mean that if you go in Sharia compliant investments that you're getting less returns. People that are doing this, it's not that they're going to be losing out. Is that a correct assessment
Yeah,
of
I
what you
think
just
that's absolutely key, and that's what we're trying to do. We don't want that Sharia investor to be penalized in any way or
said?
form. They need to generate as good as returns that's out there. And what you've seen is, Sharia funds in general have done better than the normal fund out there. And there's a
Hmm.
few reasons for that. The one is, if you go back to 2008, we had the global financial crisis. And
Right.
effectively, that was too much debt in the system. There you had a housing bubble in the United States, and Sharia funds, couldn't invest in financial services companies. They can't invest in companies that have a lot of that debt on their balance sheet. And they did very well in that financial crisis because they weren't invested in those companies that fell the most. And
Mm,
then Sharia compliant companies typically companies that have real assets. They generate income from the production that they produce. For example, a company like Cecil who produces oil, they sell that oil and they benefit from higher oil prices.
mm.
So over time, what you've seen is that the Sharia fund and the Sharia index has actually done better or kept up with the normal traditional fund that is non-Sharia compliant.
Fantastic. Now let's talk about those products, Imtiaz. Those that are listening are quite intrigued and piqued. What type of investment products does Sentio Capital Management offer your clients? Mm.
Yeah. So we have a number of unit trusts for the Sharia investor. The two that I'll highlight from a Sharia perspective is the Sharia equity fund and a Sharia balance fund. And the difference between the two is the amount of equity, and this is the share allocation between the funds. So in the Sharia equity fund, that's invested in shares primarily, and it generates a higher return, but it also comes with a higher tolerance of volatility. So if you have an investor, they have a very long time frame, they want to generate higher returns, they will typically look at the Sharia equity fund. If you look at the Sharia balance fund, the
Hmm.
equity component, this is the shares component, is limited to 75%. So you can't be 100% in shares. And the balance can be invested into sukuks, for example, which is the equivalent of a Sharia compliant bond. And then you've got property investments, listed property investments that the fund can invest in. So the returns relative to the Sharia equity fund from a balance perspective will be slightly lower because it has less risk assets, but the volatility will also be lower.
Hmm.
So you'll get a smoother return profile. And then just importantly, between the two funds. The two funds can invest locally in our market as well as globally. So,
Mm.
we've got some shares in the United States, for example, some in Dubai, some in Germany, some in Norway. So we've got shares all around the world, and we do that global allocation in-house. We go and find those stocks that we think are trading below their fair value, and we purchase them for the fund. If you look at the Sharia universe, because of the constraints from a Sharia perspective, it's typically constrained from a South African perspective. So you need to invest in other markets besides South Africa to gain exposure to shares that have high growth components, high quality
Right.
components, for example.
Right.
So that's the global component of the two funds.
Hmm. Now, Sentio Capital Management. You guys are also, you describe yourself as a investment technology company. Now, tell us where the technology comes in your investment strategy and your processes. Nowadays, those are the buzzwords, isn't it? Everybody's up to date with technology. We're not going to talk about Bitcoin and all of that, but it's a similar conversation. But
Yeah.
tell me about your technology and your investment strategy. How do you harness them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And if you look at technology and how we use technology in investing, it's basically making sense of the data that's available. The world is awash with data. Everything that we do and we work with is linked to some form of data. The cell phone that we carry around with us is constantly tracking the locations that we visit. The credit card that we use is used to see where we're spending our money. So there's a lot of data, and what we at Sentio essentially are trying to do is to use that data in an objective way to make better investment decisions. So, for example, there's Google mobility data, which is freely available on Google, and you can track how much time people are spending at different locations. So, for example, during COVID, we had a hard lockdown.
Right.
The time that people spent at home shot up, and the time that people spent at the offices obviously dropped off because people were
Mhm.
locked up.
Right.
And what we've seen is post that hard lockdown, post that 5 weeks, as people started going back to work slowly, the office time didn't recover fully. It
Mhm.
started to recover now only after 2 years to where it was pre-COVID. And for example, people were spending less time in the malls, for example. And this is data that you can track. And what this allows us to do is to make better decisions. So we can see, okay, office occupancy is under pressure. If you invested in any property companies that have a large component of office
Right.
exposure, they're going to come under pressure. If you invested in companies that have retail exposure, for example, the recovery did happen faster, and the sales have been coming through. So it's all about using the data to make better informed decisions,
Mhm.
and making sure that we make objective decisions rather than subjective. In investments, a person can feel bad, inflation is going up, petrol prices are going up, and you might think the world is going to end, for example. So you make bad decisions depending on your mood, and we want to make sure that we use data in a constructive way so we
Right.
make better investment decisions.
Mm. So it's about analytics and the study of the information and the data to make that. I think that makes total sense. Now, if anybody would like to get hold of you and is a potential investor, where do they find you? How do they find your services and so on?
Yeah. So the first port of call is
Mhm.
our website. It's www.sentio-capital.com.
Mhm.
And then Sentio is available on all of the social media platforms, for
Right.
example, on LinkedIn, on Instagram, on Twitter. We've got a media profile as well. And all of the contact details are there. And if the
Mhm.
investor wants to look at which funds are available, the fact sheets of the funds. It's all on the website, so very easily accessible. And then in
Mhm.
terms of investing into the funds, both the Sharia funds, the Sharia Equity Fund and the Sharia Balance Fund, are available on the Easy Equities platform. So it's an
Okay.
online platform. It's very easy to sign up. You go, you sign up, you open it up an account, and you can invest directly into the Sentio Sharia unit trust through that platform. And if
Mm.
they want to speak to someone, there's also contact details on the website. If they want to get more information on the fund and some of the other characteristics,
Yes.
there's also contact people that they can contact available on the website. So there's a lot of information on the website and the social media platforms.
Fantastic. So you are, encouraging people to invest for good, and I think you did mention what that means. That is the ethos of your company, and hopefully, inshallah, we'll have a lot more people realizing that when you go Islamic, you're not necessarily losing out. In fact, as you mentioned, it's quite competitive if you compare it with the other conventional investments. Imtiaz, thank you so much for your time. Jazakallah khair. May Allah reward you for your patience and your tolerance of my lateness. But thank you so much. I think you've really given us a lot to think about, and I'm sure the listeners would be in touch as well. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah, Lukman. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. That was Imtiaz Suliman there from Sentio Asset Management, and of course talking to us there about the company that was established 15 years ago. One of the pioneers in this field, and of course you can go to the website www.sentio-capital.com to find out more. We're bringing us to the end of the program. Jazakallah khair to you for tuning in. Until next week, from myself and Brother Sadiq, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa